Why is the maid still standing? The whisper slipped through Blackridge Palace, just as Alpha King Alexander Sterling entered the Great Hall, and Grace Holloway knew immediately that someone was talking about her. She stood near the eastern wall with a polished silver tray balanced between both hands, surrounded by servants who had spent the entire morning preparing for the winter crown assembly. Crystal chandeliers burned overhead, snow pressed white against the towering windows. Nearly 200 wolves filled the hall, from royal guards in dark uniforms to visiting alphas dressed in formal coats bearing the crests of their packs. Then Alexander crossed the threshold, and the atmosphere changed. Grace felt it before she understood it. A deep pressure rolled through the room, silent and invisible, carrying the unmistakable authority of the Alpha King. Conversations stopped. Heads lowered. Several servants beside Grace bent almost instinctively, their shoulders tightening beneath the weight of royal dominance. Even powerful visiting wolves lowered their eyes. Grace waited for the same force to push against her. Nothing happened. She felt Alexander's presence, certainly. It was steady and immense, like standing near the ocean during a winter storm. But it did not frighten her. It did not weaken her knees. It did not make her inner wolf retreat. Grace lowered her head anyway because that was what palace servants were expected to do. She had learned long ago that survival at Blackridge depended less on being invisible than on never giving anyone a reason to remember you. Still, curiosity made her glance upward. Alexander Sterling was taller than she expected, with dark brown hair, a composed expression, and gray eyes that seemed to notice everything without appearing to search. At 32, he had ruled the Northern Royal Pacts for nearly 7 years. Grace knew the stories. He could silence a council chamber by entering it. Rival alphas reconsidered arguments when he merely looked their way. Yet there was nothing theatrical about him now. He simply walked toward the raised royal table while the room yielded around him. Then he stopped. Grace's fingers tightened slightly around the tray. Alexander had turned his head. His gaze moved across the servants and settled directly on her. For one uncomfortable second, Grace wondered whether she had spilled something on her uniform. She checked the tray. 6 glasses. Perfectly arranged. Nothing wrong. When she looked up again, Alexander was still watching her. Royal Beta Mason Caldwell stepped closer to the king and murmured something Grace could not hear. Alexander answered without taking his eyes from her. Grace lowered her gaze again. Whatever had caught his attention, she wanted no part of it. She had been working at Blackridge Palace for 3 years. She cleaned guest rooms, carried meals, polished silver, and remembered exactly how every visiting noble preferred their coffee. Nobody important had ever asked where she came from. Nobody cared that she had no family name beyond the one given to her by the woman who raised her. To the palace, Grace Holloway was simply an Omega maid. Useful, quiet, forgettable. That was safe. A bell sounded, announcing the beginning of the assembly, and Grace moved toward the banquet tables with the other servants. As she passed within 10 feet of Alexander, the royal pressure strengthened. 2 servants beside her stumbled briefly before recovering. Grace felt nothing except warmth beneath the small silver pendant hidden under her collar. She stopped. The pendant had never done that before. Across the hall, Alexander stopped too. Their eyes met once more. This time, the Alpha King was not merely curious. He looked puzzled. Mason leaned toward him. "Your Majesty?" Alexander's gaze followed Grace as she continued walking. "That Omega," he said quietly. "Find out who she is." Grace spent the next hour pretending she had not noticed the Alpha King watching her. It was harder than it sounded. Every time she crossed the Great Hall with a fresh tray, she felt the strange awareness of Alexander somewhere behind her, quiet but impossible to ignore. She focused on familiar things instead. Coffee for the Western delegation. Hot cider for the elders. Fresh linens for the royal table. Simple tasks had rules, and Grace liked rules. They kept life predictable. "Holloway." The sharp voice came from beside the central staircase. Lady Evelyn Ashford stood beneath the marble archway in an ivory winter gown, surrounded by 2 attendants. Grace stopped immediately. "Yes, Lady Evelyn?" Evelyn's gaze dropped to the silver pitcher in Grace's hands. "Why are you serving this section?" Mrs. Bennet assigned me to the north tables this morning. This is reserved for noble families. Grace glanced toward the table. I understand. I was only bringing the cider you requested. Evelyn smiled without warmth. Then bring it and remember your place. Several nearby guests heard her. Grace felt their attention settle on her, waiting for embarrassment. 3 years ago, that attention would have made her hands shake. Today, she simply placed the pitcher on the table. Of course. Evelyn seemed disappointed by the lack of reaction. You Omegas become very comfortable when people are kind to you. Grace met her eyes for only a second. She was not angry. Mostly, she was tired. The cider will stay warm for about 20 minutes. I can replace it after that. A nearby attendant covered a smile. Evelyn's expression tightened. Grace quietly turned away. She had taken only a few steps when she realized Alexander stood near the foot of the staircase with Mason beside him. He had heard everything. Grace lowered her eyes and continued toward the service corridor. Interesting, Mason murmured after she passed. Alexander looked at him. What did you learn? Grace Holloway, 24 years old, Omega. She arrived at Blackridge 3 years ago from Cedar Glen territory. No recorded parents. No known pack affiliation before childhood. Alexander glanced toward the corridor where Grace had disappeared. And her wolf. Unremarkable, according to the employment records. Almost no dominant scent. No history of challenging rank. Yet she stood beneath mine without reacting. Mason lowered his voice. I noticed. In the service corridor, Grace leaned against the cool stone wall and finally released the breath she had been holding. Her fingers went automatically to the pendant beneath her collar. It was warm again. She pulled it free. The small silver disc was old, its edges softened by years of touch. 2 wolves were engraved upon its surface, both kneeling beneath a crescent moon. Grace had owned it for as long as she could remember. The woman who raised her had said it was found around Grace's neck when she was a child. Nothing more. Footsteps approached. Grace quickly tucked the pendant away. A young kitchen servant hurried around the corner carrying a stack of plates almost high enough to hide her face. Grace, Mrs. Bennet needs you in the courtyard. 2 guards are arguing and nobody can get them to stop. Grace frowned. Why would she need me? She said you were good at calming people down. Grace almost laughed. That is not exactly a royal skill. She followed anyway. Neither woman noticed Alexander standing at the far end of the corridor. He had seen the pendant before Grace hit it. For the first time that morning, the Alpha King's calm expression disappeared. He knew that symbol. The winter courtyard was unusually quiet when Grace stepped through the arched doors, but the silence was not peaceful. 2 royal guards stood nearly 20 feet apart beside the fountain, their shoulders rigid, their voices low and strained. A handful of servants watched from beneath the covered walkway. Mrs. Bennet hurried toward Grace. Thank goodness. They have been arguing for 10 minutes. Grace stared at her. And you thought the maid carrying cider should solve it? I thought you could get them to listen. Grace sighed and approached carefully. The older guard was insisting that the eastern gate remain closed during the assembly. The younger one had received instructions to open it for an arriving delegation. Neither seemed willing to step aside long enough to confirm the order. Excuse me, Grace said. They ignored her. Gentlemen. Still nothing. Grace felt something strange stir beneath her ribs, the same quiet warmth she had felt when Alexander entered the great hall. She stepped closer. Enough. Both guards stopped speaking. Not gradually. Instantly. Their heads turned toward her at the same time. Grace blinked. There is obviously a written order somewhere. Find it before either of you spends another 10 minutes arguing about who remembers it correctly. The younger guard's shoulders relaxed. Yes, Miss Holloway. The older guard nodded. Of course. They walked toward the security office without another word. Grace stared after them. Mrs. Bennet smiled. See? You have a gift. They finally decided to behave like adults. Whatever helps you sleep tonight. Grace turned back toward the palace, but Mason Caldwell stood beneath the archway. His expression made her pause. Is something wrong, Royal Beta? No. Mason glanced toward the departing guards. What did you just do? Ask them to stop arguing. You told them to stop. There is a difference? Mason almost answered, then apparently reconsidered. Perhaps. Grace returned inside, unaware that Mason remained in the courtyard long after she left. An hour later, he found Alexander in the royal study. You were right to be curious about her. Alexander looked up from a stack of assembly documents. What happened? Mason described the courtyard. Alexander listened without interruption. Did she use dominance? None that I could sense. Did the guards know her? Only as a palace maid. Alexander leaned back slowly. And they obeyed immediately. Their wolves responded before they seemed to understand why. Alexander's gaze moved toward the snow beyond the study windows. The pendant? Mason asked. Two wolves kneeling beneath a crescent moon. Alexander stood and crossed to a locked cabinet. From inside, he removed an old leather-bound volume and opened it carefully. Several pages showed faded royal crests. Then he stopped at one nearly identical to Grace's pendant. Mason read the inscription beneath it, Moon Sovereign. Alexander closed the book before he could continue. That bloodline disappeared more than 20 years ago. Apparently not. Alexander's expression remained controlled, but Mason knew him too well to miss the concern beneath it. Do not tell anyone yet, including Grace? Especially Grace. Not until we know what this means. Across the palace, Grace was arranging cups in a private dining room when raised voices drifted from the hallway. Two young visiting wolves were arguing over seating assignments. Grace stepped into the corridor. Please lower your voices. Both went silent. One actually took a step backward before bowing his head. Grace froze. The other did the same. This time, she could not dismiss it as coincidence. The warmth beneath her collar returned. Her pendant felt almost hot against her skin. Grace touched it through the fabric, suddenly uneasy. Far across Blackridge Palace, Alexander opened the ancient book again. Beneath the moon's sovereign crest was a single handwritten sentence. He read it twice, then a third time. The sovereign voice does not demand obedience. The wolf remembers it. Grace was polishing the last silver serving tray when Mrs. Bennet appeared in the doorway. The king wants to see you. Grace nearly dropped the cloth. Me? Unless another Grace Holloway has been hiding in my kitchens for 3 years. Mrs. Bennet straightened Grace's collar with brisk hands. Royal Library. Now. Grace crossed Blackridge Palace with a growing sense that every hallway had become too quiet. She had spent years learning which doors servants used and which rooms belonged to people whose names appeared on maps. The Royal Library was definitely the second kind. When she entered, Alexander stood beside a tall window overlooking the snowy grounds. No guards surrounded him. Only Mason waited near the fireplace. Miss Holloway, Alexander said. Thank you for coming. Grace folded her hands. I was told it was an order, Your Majesty. Something almost amused passed through his gray eyes. Then I should thank you for obeying it. Mason quietly excused himself, leaving them alone. Grace noticed an old leather-bound book resting on the desk, but Alexander closed it before she could see the page. How long have you worked here? He asked. 3 years. Before Blackridge? Cedar Glen. Your family still lives there? Grace's fingers tightened. I do not have a family there. Alexander's expression softened. I apologize. You did not know. That is what I am trying to correct. Grace looked at him. Why? The question escaped before caution could stop it. Alexander did not seem offended. Because unusual. Things have happened around you today. People arguing is not unusual. Royal wolves obeying an omega they barely know is. Grace felt warmth gather beneath her collar. I did not make anyone do anything. I believe you. That answer unsettled her more than accusation would have. Alexander stepped closer to the desk, leaving several feet between them. Were you born in Cedar Glen? I do not know where I was born. Grace swallowed. A woman named Margaret Holloway raised me. She found me when I was very young. How young? Maybe 2. There were no records. Alexander's attention sharpened. Was anything found with you? Grace immediately thought of the pendant. Her hand moved toward it before she could stop herself. Alexander noticed. May I see it? Grace hesitated, then pulled the silver disc from beneath her collar. The engraved wolves caught the firelight. Alexander became completely still. "Have you seen this before?" she asked. "Something similar." "Where?" "In old royal records." Grace stared at him. For 22 years, the pendant had been the only unanswered piece of her childhood. Now the answer might be sitting inside the king's library. "What does it mean?" Alexander looked toward the closed book. "I am not certain enough to tell you yet." Disappointment tightened her chest. "Then why bring me here?" "Because I wanted to know whether you understood what was happening." Grace gave a quiet laugh with no humor in it. "This morning I was carrying coffee. By lunch, guards were listening to me like I outranked them. I understand nothing." Alexander studied her for a moment. "Are you afraid?" Grace considered the question. "I am afraid everyone else will decide what this means before I get the chance." Something changed in his face. "Respect, perhaps. Then I will make certain they do not." A bell sounded from the great hall, calling guests back for the evening session. Grace tucked the pendant beneath her collar. As she turned toward the door, Alexander spoke again. "Grace." She stopped. It was the first time he had used her first name. "Tomorrow, the Crown Assembly begins its formal oath ceremony. Stay near the Great Hall." As a servant, Alexander glanced once at the hidden pendant. "For now." Grace left with more questions than answers. Behind her, Alexander reopened the ancient book. This time, he turned beyond the crest to a faded list of names. His eyes stopped on the final entry recorded 24 years earlier. A newborn daughter. Missing. Alexander slowly looked toward the door Grace had just closed. By the following morning, Blackridge Palace no longer felt like a home Grace understood. The Great Hall had been transformed for the formal Crown Assembly, with long royal banners hanging between the marble columns and the crests of 12 northern packs displayed beneath the winter sunlight. Grace moved quietly along the outer tables, setting glasses beside polished silver pitchers, while visiting alphas gathered near the center of the room. She had slept badly. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Alexander studying her pendant, then heard his unfinished words. "Old royal records." Something similar. "For now." Grace disliked those two words most of all. "You are pouring water onto an empty table." Grace looked down. Mrs. Bennet stood beside her, trying not to smile. "I suppose that explains why nobody complained. Your mind is somewhere else." "I am fine." Mrs. Bennet gave her the look of a woman who had supervised servants long enough to recognize a lie, but the ceremonial bells sounded before she could respond. Conversations faded. Alexander entered with Mason Caldwell and took his place before the raised royal table. Grace felt his dominance roll through the hall again. Around her, wolves straightened, lowered their eyes, or shifted uneasily beneath the pressure. Grace felt only the familiar warmth beneath her collar. Her pendant was responding again. "Grace Holloway." Lady Evelyn Ashford's voice came from behind her. Grace turned. Evelyn held out an empty glass. "I believe servants are supposed to notice when guests need something." "Of course." Grace filled it. Evelyn did not move. "I also believe servants remain behind the marked line during the oath ceremony." Grace glanced down. In her distraction, one foot had crossed the narrow gold border separating the service area from the noble assembly floor. She stepped back immediately. "My mistake." Some mistakes come from forgetting where one belongs. Grace kept her expression calm. "Then it is fortunate I remembered." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, but another voice interrupted them. "Young woman." An elderly man seated nearby was staring at Grace. Elder Thomas Whitaker had arrived from Silver Ridge that morning, one of the oldest advisors recognized by the Royal Council. His attention was fixed on the pendant that had slipped outside Grace's collar. "Where did you get that?" Grace touched it instinctively. "I have always had it." Thomas slowly rose. The color seemed to leave his face. "May I see it?" Before Grace could answer, a sharp disagreement erupted near the center of the hall. Two visiting alphas were arguing over the succession rights to Pine Valley territory. A third alpha joined them, then another. Their voices remained controlled, but the atmosphere changed instantly. Dominance spread outward in overlapping waves. Several servants retreated toward the walls. Glasses trembled against the tables. Grace felt wolves throughout the hall becoming restless, responding to the tension even when their owners tried to remain composed. Alexander stood. Enough. His voice carried across the great hall. Most of the room immediately fell silent. The four alphas did not. Years of rivalry had pushed their wolves too close to the surface, and each man seemed more focused on resisting the others than hearing the king. Alexander's expression hardened. This dispute ends now. The royal command rolled through the chamber with enough force to make nearby guests bow their heads. Still, one alpha challenged another across the assembly floor. Grace noticed movement near them. A young servant, perhaps 16, stood frozen beside an overturned tray, trapped between the arguing nobles and too frightened to move. Grace set down her pitcher. "Do not," Evelyn whispered. "Stay where you belong." Grace looked at the frightened girl. Something inside her became perfectly still. She stepped across the gold line. Alexander saw her. Mason saw her. Elder Thomas stared at the pendant glowing against her uniform. Grace walked toward the center of the great hall, and for the first time that morning, every wolf nearest her began turning its head in her direction. Grace had crossed only a few feet beyond the gold line when the pressure inside the great hall changed again. The four visiting alphas were no longer simply arguing about Pine Valley. Their wolves were answering one another, each surge of dominance provoking the next until even guests far from the dispute shifted uneasily. The young servant remained frozen beside the overturned tray. Grace kept walking toward her. "Grace." Alexander's voice reached her from across the hall. It was not a warning. It sounded almost like a question. Grace met his eyes for 1 second, then looked back at the frightened girl. "Come toward me," she said gently. The servant tried, but another wave of alpha pressure swept through the room, and she stopped. Alexander stepped down from the royal platform. Enough. His command carried through the marble chamber, deep and unmistakable. Several visiting wolves immediately lowered their heads. The royal guards became still. Yet the four alphas at the center remained caught in their dispute, their instincts pushing against one another so strongly that reason seemed unable to reach them. Alexander's jaw tightened. "Stand down. All of you." 3 obeyed enough to step back. The 4th remained rigid, struggling against the command as the others reacted to his resistance. Grace felt something inside her answer. Not anger, not fear. Something older and strangely calm. Her pendant became hot against her chest. Elder Thomas gripped the edge of his table. "Your Majesty," he said quietly. Alexander glanced toward him. Thomas was not looking at the arguing alphas. He was staring at Grace. She reached the young servant and held out her hand. "Look at me." The girl did. "You're safe. Walk behind me." Slowly, the servant moved. Grace guided her toward the outer tables, but a nearby alpha suddenly raised his voice again. The girl flinched. Grace stopped. She had spent 24 years being told what an Omega should do when powerful wolves filled a room. Lower your eyes. Keep your voice soft. Stay out of the way. Remember your place. For the first time, none of those lessons made sense. A frightened girl needed help. A room full of leaders had forgotten how to listen. And Grace was tired of pretending that silence was the same thing as peace. She turned toward the assembly. "Stop." The word was not loud. Still, the nearest wolves went silent. Grace felt the warmth beneath her collar spread through her chest, steady as a second heartbeat. Alexander stared at her. Mason's expression changed. The 4 alphas slowly turned. Every pair of eyes in the great hall seemed to find Grace at once. Lady Evelyn stood near the gold line, pale with disbelief. "Grace," she whispered, "come back here." Grace barely heard her. Beneath the confusion, beneath the pressure of dozens of alpha wolves, she sensed something she had never noticed before. They were listening, not the people, the wolves inside them, waiting. Alexander took another step toward her, then stopped when Elder Thomas caught his arm. "Do not interrupt this." Alexander looked sharply at him. "You know what is happening?" Thomas swallowed. "I know what may be happening." Grace's pendant slipped free of her collar. Silver light moved across the engraved crescent moon. A murmur traveled through the elders. One of them stood. Another stared at the symbol, as if seeing a memory return from another lifetime. Grace looked around the great hall, suddenly aware that she was standing where servants were never meant to stand. Yet she felt no fear, only certainty. The arguing alphas shifted again, and the young servant behind Grace drew a frightened breath. Something ancient rose through Grace's voice before she could question it. This time, she did not ask them to stop. She gave them one command: kneel. The word seemed too small to change anything. Grace had not shouted. She had not stepped forward with the force of an alpha or filled the great hall with dominance. She had simply spoken. Yet the first visiting alpha lowered himself to one knee. Then the second followed. The third bowed his head and knelt beside him. Within seconds, the fourth did the same. A ripple moved outward through the hall. Royal guards lowered themselves in. Perfect silence. Betas followed. Visiting pack leaders who had spent their lives answering to almost no one suddenly bent their knees as though their wolves had recognized a law older than rank. Grace stopped breathing. She had wanted the argument to end. Nothing more. But the response continued. One row after another, the royal pack knelt before an Omega Maid in a plain gray uniform. Lady Evelyn stared around her in disbelief before her own knees slowly bent beneath her. No, she whispered. This is impossible. Mason Caldwell was already kneeling near the royal platform, but his expression held no fear. Only astonishment. Elder Thomas lowered himself with tears shining in his eyes. Grace looked toward Alexander. The Alpha King remained standing. For one frightened moment, she wondered whether she had challenged him without meaning to. Then she realized something stranger. Whatever had moved through the others had reached him too. She could see it in the sudden stillness of his shoulders, in the way his wolf seemed to recognize her presence. But the command had passed around him like water around stone. Grace had not been speaking to Alexander. Somehow, the power had understood that. What did I do? She whispered. Alexander stepped toward her slowly. Nobody else moved. I think you stopped them. Grace looked at the kneeling wolves. I told them to kneel. Yes. I did not mean this. I know. His calm voice gave her something solid to hold on to. Grace touched the pendant at her chest. Its silver surface was warm, but the glow had faded. Make them stand. Alexander glanced toward Elder Thomas. The old advisor shook his head. I do not believe he can. Grace stared at him. What? Thomas rose only enough to look at her clearly, though his wolf still seemed unwilling to let him fully stand. The sovereign voice answers only to the one who carries it. A murmur moved through the kneeling assembly. Evelyn's face sharpened. Forbidden magic. Alexander turned toward her. Be careful. Your Majesty, she commanded royal alphas to kneel. She is a servant, an Omega. Grace felt those words strike an old place inside her, but they no longer had the same weight. Alexander's expression became cold. Her rank does not explain what happened, and neither does her occupation. Elder Thomas looked at Grace's pendant. May I see it? Grace hesitated, then removed the chain and placed the silver disc in his open palm. Thomas examined the two kneeling wolves beneath the crescent moon. His hands began to tremble. I thought every one of these had been lost. Alexander's eyes narrowed. You recognize it. I recognize more than the pendant. Thomas looked at Grace. How old are you? 24. And you were found as a child? Grace nodded slowly. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, as though confirming something he had feared to hope for. When he opened them, he looked toward Alexander. The last daughter of the Moon's sovereign line disappeared 24 years ago. Silence deepened across the hall. Grace felt suddenly unsteady. What are you saying? Thomas returned the pendant to her with extraordinary care. I am saying that you were never an ordinary Omega. Grace looked at the kneeling royal pack, then at Alexander. Then what am I? Before Thomas could answer, Alexander lowered his head toward her. Not because her command required it. Because he chose to. Alexander's gesture changed the room more completely than Grace's command had. The Alpha King had not knelt. He had not surrendered his crown or lowered himself beneath her authority. He simply bowed his head, slowly and deliberately, before raising his eyes to meet hers again. Respect. Grace understood that before Elder Thomas spoke. The Moon Sovereigns were never kings in the way the Sterling line rules today, Thomas said. His voice carried through the silent hall. They were mediators between pacts long before the Northern Territories were united. Their gift was not alpha dominance. It was the sovereign voice. Grace looked around at the wolves still kneeling. Then why can they not stand? Because you have not released them. The answer filled her with immediate discomfort. She had spent her life being ordered where to stand. The last thing she wanted was an entire room trapped beneath her words. Grace drew a careful breath. Stand. The effect was immediate. Wolves rose throughout the great hall, some slowly, others with visible surprise. Royal guards straightened. Visiting alphas exchanged uncertain looks. Mason returned to Alexander's side. Lady Evelyn stood last, her face pale. Grace felt relief stronger than triumph. Thomas noticed. That, he said quietly, is why the gift was trusted to your bloodline. Evelyn recovered enough to speak. Trusted? She has worked here carrying trays. We know nothing about her. We know what she chose when power answered her, Alexander said. Evelyn looked toward him. Your Majesty, surely you cannot accept this based on an old pendant and one strange event. I am not accepting anything without evidence. Alexander turned to Thomas. Tell us what can be proven. Thomas nodded. The pendant bears the private crest of the Holloway branch of the Moon Sovereign line. It was never used publicly. 24 years ago, their estate disappeared from royal records after a succession crisis. Their infant daughter was reported missing. Her given name was Grace. Grace's breath caught. Grace? Thomas looked at her gently. Yes. For years, she had assumed Margaret Holloway had chosen both her first and last name. Suddenly, even that certainty shifted beneath her feet. Margaret knew. Perhaps enough to protect you, Thomas said. We cannot know until the archives are examined. Alexander stepped closer, stopping several feet away. Then we examine them.
No assumptions. No ceremony.
Grace gets the truth before anyone decides what the truth requires of her. The words settled something inside her. Lady Evelyn looked from Grace to the king. And, until then, she returns to the servants' quarters. Alexander did not answer immediately. He looked at Grace instead. That is not my decision. Evelyn seemed stunned. She is employed by the palace. She is also standing in front of us after discovering that everything she believed about herself may be incomplete. His voice remained calm. She deserves more than having another person choose her next step. Grace had never heard a king speak about choice as though it mattered more than rank. She looked down at her gray uniform, then at the silver pendant resting against it. An hour ago, both had seemed to belong to different worlds. Now they were parts of the same life. I do not want anyone kneeling to me, she said. Thomas smiled faintly. Your ancestors said much the same. Grace looked toward the visiting alphas. And I do not want a title simply because an old book says I inherited one. Alexander's expression softened. Then do not take one. What happens to me now? Whatever happens, he said, you will have a voice in it. Grace almost laughed at the strange perfection of those words. Around her stood the most powerful wolves in the Northern Territories, and for the first time, nobody was telling her to remember her place. Alexander extended his hand, not as a command, but an invitation. Walk with me to the archives. Grace looked at his hand, then placed hers in it. Behind them, the royal pack remained standing. The royal archives confirmed what Grace had spent 24 years believing she would never know. Her name was Grace Holloway. Margaret had not invented it. She had preserved it. Records sealed inside a cedar case showed that Grace was the missing daughter of the final Holloway family entrusted with the Moon Sovereign gift. Margaret had served that household and carried Grace away when the family line disappeared from public life, protecting the child from the political struggle surrounding the old bloodline. Grace sat quietly at the archive table as Elder Thomas finished reading. Alexander stood nearby, giving her the silence she needed. So I was never abandoned, Grace said. Thomas shook his head.
No.
You were protected. Grace closed her eyes. For years, she had imagined parents who had forgotten her. The truth did not return the family she had lost, but it gave their absence a different shape. By evening, the Crown Assembly gathered again in the Great Hall. Grace entered through the same service doorway she had used hundreds of times. She wore no crown.
No ceremonial gown.
Only a simple dark blue dress and the silver pendant that had finally become more than a mystery. Conversations stopped as she crossed the room. Nobody knelt. Grace was grateful for that. Alexander waited near the royal table with Mason and Elder Thomas. The council needs to know what role you intend to claim, Thomas said gently. Grace looked around the hall. Yesterday, she would have carried glasses through this room while powerful wolves discussed the future above her head. Today those same wolves waited for her answer. I do not want a throne, she said. And I do not want anyone obeying me because they are afraid of what my voice can do. Several alphas exchanged glances. Grace continued. But if this gift once existed to help Pax listen when pride made that impossible, then I want to learn how to use it responsibly. Thomas bowed his head. Then the Moon's sovereign seat on the Royal Council can be restored. Grace looked toward Alexander. Is that what you want? His answer came without hesitation. What I want is not the question. Grace almost smiled. You are getting very good at saying that. A quiet warmth entered his expression. I have had an excellent teacher. Later, after the assembly ended, Grace remained alone near the gold line that had once separated servants from nobles. Alexander approached and stopped beside her. 3 days ago, I thought you were a maid who somehow resisted royal dominance. Grace glanced at him. I am still a maid until Mrs. Bennet approves my resignation. Alexander laughed softly. I would never challenge Mrs. Bennet. Grace looked across the empty hall. What am I here now? Alexander considered her question. Whatever you choose to become.
No prophecy.
No command. No title forced upon her.
Just choice.
Grace stepped across the gold line. Then she turned toward the servants still waiting near the walls, the guards beside the doors, and the council members preparing to leave. She remembered how easily one word had brought an entire room to its knees. Power could do that. But Grace finally understood that making people smaller was not the kind of strength she wanted. Everyone, she said, her voice calm enough to reach the hall without carrying command. Stand with me. Mrs. Bennet moved first. Mason followed. Then the elders, guards, servants, and alphas gathered together without rank separating. One side of the room from the other. Alexander came last, taking his place beside Grace rather than ahead of her. She touched the silver pendant at her heart and smiled. For most of her life, Grace had been told to remember her place. At last she understood. Her place was not beneath anyone. And true power was never proven by how many people knelt before you, but by how many you helped stand.